He became one of the most recognizable faces on Earth. Without ever seeking fame, before the posters, before the slogans, before the myth, there was a thin Argentine medical student struggling to breathe through chronic asthma. A young man who spent long nights reading philosophy, politics, and poetry while the rest of the world slept. Nothing about Ernesto Guevara's early life suggested he would become a global symbol of rebellion. And yet, somewhere between the pages of books and the dust of Latin American roads, something irreversible began to form. In 1951, he set out on a long motorcycle journey across South America. Not as a soldier, not as a revolutionary. Just a student trying to understand the continent he called home. What he found was poverty so severe it reshaped his thinking. Leper colonies cut off from society. Miners working in conditions that felt closer to the 19th century than the 20th. He kept notes, observed quietly, asked questions that had no easy answers. Those travels did not give him power. They gave him anger and direction. Within a few years, Ernesto would meet a small group of exiles planning to overthrow a dictator in Cuba. One conversation would pull him from medicine, toward armed struggle, and into history itself. But the world still didn't know his name, and the man he was about to become would divide the world for generations. In Mexico City, the future did not announce itself with certainty. It arrived quietly, in a cramped apartment filled with arguments about revolution. Ernesto Guevara had come there in 1954, after witnessing the US-backed overthrow of Guatemala's reformist government. The experience hardened him. He concluded that peaceful change in Latin America could be crushed from outside, and that only armed resistance might survive. It was a conviction forming in real time, shaped by defeat rather than victory. Then he met Fidel Castro. Castro was organizing a return to Cuba after a failed attack on the Moncada barracks. Many dismissed the plan as unrealistic. Too few men, too little money. Almost no chance of success. Guevara listened anyway. What persuaded him was not certainty, but resolve. He later said he joined without hesitation, convinced that the struggle against dictatorship justified the risk. Training began in secret. Long marches. Weapons practice. Endless political debate about what kind of society should follow victory if victory ever came. Guevara was not Cuban. He had no personal stake in the island's politics. Yet he chose to fight. In November 1956, 82 rebels crowded onto a small yacht named Granma and sailed toward Cuba. The landing was a disaster. Government forces attacked almost immediately. Many were killed. Others scattered into the countryside. When the chaos ended, only a small handful remained in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Among the survivors was the Argentine doctor who had decided to become a revolutionary. And from that moment on, retreat was no longer possible. The mountains did not promise victory. They offered only survival. One day at a time. In the Sierra Maestra, the rebel force was reduced to a few dozen exhausted fighters, short on food, weapons, and medicine. Government troops hunted them through unfamiliar terrain. At any moment, the rebellion could have ended quietly, remembered, if at all, as another failed uprising in a long history of failed uprisings. Ernesto Guevara adapted quickly. He treated the wounded when fighting stopped. He carried a rifle when it began again. Asthma attacks struck without warning, sometimes leaving him gasping for breath in the humid mountain air. He demanded strict behavior from the fighters, insisting on order, study, and political education even while they were constantly moving. To him, survival without purpose meant nothing. Months passed, then something shifted. Peasants in the region began offering quiet support, information, shelter. Batista's army, larger and better equipped, struggled to control territory it could not fully understand. Small guerrilla victories slowly built momentum, not dramatic, but cumulative. Guevara proved himself in combat and organization. By 1957, he was promoted to Comandante, one of the highest ranks in the rebel army. The doctor had become a military leader. Still, the outcome remained uncertain. Governments had crushed rebellions like this before. History suggested the same ending was likely again. But history was about to turn. Not in Havana, but deep inside the mountains, where a small, determined force refused to disappear. And the next phase would decide whether they were rebels or the future rulers of Cuba. By late 1958, the balance of power in Cuba was shifting quietly at first, then all at once. Government offensives had failed to eliminate the rebels in the mountains. Instead, the guerrilla movement expanded, spreading beyond the Sierra Maestra into new regions of the island. What began as survival had turned into strategy. Columns of fighters moved through the countryside, cutting supply lines, seizing towns, and weakening Batista's control piece by piece. Ernesto Guevara was given command of one of these columns and ordered to move westward across difficult terrain, toward the central city of Santa Clara. The journey demanded endurance more than numbers. His force was smaller and less equipped than the army it faced. Every decision carried risk, not only for the mission, but for the civilians living in the path of the conflict. As the rebels advanced, Batista's government grew increasingly unstable. Corruption, military setbacks, and declining support created pressure from within as much as from outside. The outcome was no longer unthinkable. It was approaching. In December 1958, Guevara's column reached Santa Clara. The battle that followed became one of the decisive moments of the Cuban Revolution. Rebel fighters derailed an armored train sent by the government to reinforce the city, capturing weapons and prisoners. Within days, Santa Clara fell under rebel control. On January 1, 1959, Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba. The dictatorship collapsed almost overnight. What had begun with a handful of survivors in the mountains had ended in national victory. Guevara entered Havana, not as a wandering doctor, but as a central figure in a successful revolution. Power, once distant and abstract, was now real. And revolutions, history shows, are defined not only by how they win, but by what they do next. Victory did not bring silence. It brought responsibility and scrutiny. In the first months of 1959, the new revolutionary government moved quickly to consolidate power. Institutions tied to the previous regime were dismantled. Trials were held for officials accused of torture and repression under Batista. Ernesto Guevara, now firmly inside the leadership circle, was placed in charge of the La Cabana fortress in Havana, where many of these proceedings occurred. Supporters argued the trials delivered long-delayed justice after years of dictatorship. Critics called them rushed, political, irreversible. The truth was inseparable from the tension of the moment. A revolution that had promised liberation now faced the burden of governing under global attention, internal expectation, and the constant fear of counterattack. Decisions made in urgency would shape how the world judged the new Cuba for decades. Guevara's role expanded beyond the battlefield. He became president of the National Bank of Cuba, despite limited formal training in economics. Later, he was appointed Minister of Industries, tasked with transforming the country's economic system along socialist lines. Factories were reorganized. Land and businesses were nationalized. The pace was intense, driven by belief that delay could threaten the revolution's survival. Yet governing proved more complex than fighting. Production problems emerged, shortages grew. International pressure tightened, especially as relations with the United States rapidly deteriorated. Cuba moved closer to the Soviet Union, pulling the island into the center of Cold War rivalry. Through it all, Guevara spoke with unwavering conviction about sacrifice, equality, and the creation of what he called a new man shaped by collective purpose rather than personal gain. But conviction can inspire, and it can divide. And as Cuba's revolution settled into power, Guevara himself began to look beyond the island toward struggles he believed were still unfinished. By the early 1960s, Ernesto Guevara was no longer only a Cuban revolutionary. He was becoming an international figure studied, criticized, admired, and watched. He traveled widely as a representative of the new Cuban government, visiting countries across Africa, Asia, and the Soviet bloc. In speeches, he argued that colonialism and economic dependence were not separate problems, but parts of the same global system. His message was direct: revolutions should not remain isolated, they should multiply. In 1964, he stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Calm, voice, military uniform. A man once unknown, now addressing the world's most powerful governments. He condemned racism, imperialism, and foreign intervention, particularly in Latin America and Africa. Supporters heard moral clarity. Opponents heard dangerous provocation. Either way, he was no longer just a participant in history. He was shaping its arguments in real time. Yet, behind the public role, frustration was growing. Cuba's economy struggled despite sweeping reforms. Dependence on Soviet support created tensions inside the revolutionary leadership. Guevara favored rapid industrialization and continued global insurgency. Others urged caution, stability, and survival within Cold War realities. The differences were strategic, but also personal. Then, in 1965, he disappeared from public view. No official explanation, no public appearances. Rumors spread across continents. Had he fallen from power? Was he on a secret mission? Or had he chosen to leave everything behind, including the government he helped create? Months later, a letter written to Fidel Castro would be revealed, confirming that Guevara had renounced his positions in Cuba to continue revolutionary struggle elsewhere. He was walking away from authority, toward uncertainty. And the next place he chose would test whether his ideas could survive beyond the island where they first succeeded.
In our previous chapter, we traced the incredible rise of Ernesto Guevara from a young Argentine doctor to a central figure of the Cuban Revolution. Side by side with Fidel Castro, he fought through the rugged mountains to overthrow the oppressive dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. With the victory won, Guevara assumed the position of immense power, serving as a key leader within the newly formed Cuban government. He worked tirelessly in offices and factories, but the quiet life of an administrator was never his ultimate destination or final goal, that the fire of revolution had to spread far beyond the shores of Cuba to liberate the oppressed across the globe. Driven by this conviction, Guevara made a fateful decision to leave his titles behind, departing secretly into the shadows to continue the struggle. His next destination was not announced to the world, it was hidden deep in Central Africa. In 1965, Ernesto Guevara traveled secretly to the Congo, where a rebellion had formed after the assassination of independence leader Patrice Lumumba. The region was unstable, fractured by competing factions. To Guevara, it looked like the front line of a wider anti-colonial struggle. If revolution could take hold there, he believed it might spread. Reality proved far more complicated. Communication between rebel groups was weak, training was inconsistent. Discipline so central to Guevara's strategy in Cuba was difficult to maintain. He found himself confronting problems that ideology alone could not solve. Cultural differences, logistical failures, and limited local support undermined the effort. Even basic coordination became uncertain. The conditions that had allowed guerrilla warfare to grow in Cuba were largely absent. Months passed with little progress, illness spread, morale declined. Guevara later described the mission as a painful lesson, one that revealed how fragile revolutionary theory could become. By late 1965, the campaign was quietly abandoned. He left Africa in secrecy, the operation largely unknown to the outside world. For the first time since joining Castro's movement, he had faced unmistakable failure. Yet failure did not end his commitment. If anything, it sharpened it. After a brief, hidden return to Cuba, Guevara began planning once more. He searched for another place where revolution, against the odds, might still be possible. He chose Bolivia, and this final decision would define how history remembered him. Bolivia was meant to be a beginning, instead, it would become an ending. In 1966, Ernesto Guevara entered the country in secret, using a false identity and altered appearance. The plan was ambitious: build a rural guerrilla movement that could ignite revolution across South America. From a small nucleus of fighters, he believed momentum could spread beyond borders, repeating what had happened in Cuba. But from the start, the conditions were different. Local support was limited. Communication with allies outside the country was unreliable. The Bolivian Communist Party, expected to assist, fractured over strategy. Isolation grew slowly. Then all at once, supplies ran short. Illness returned. Government forces, trained and advised with foreign assistance, tightened their search through the rugged terrain. Guevara kept a detailed diary during the campaign. Its entries reveal exhaustion, frustration, and persistent stays marked by hunger, difficult marches, and constant danger. Yet they also show that he refused to abandon the mission, even as the possibility of success narrowed. By October 1967, the guerrilla group was surrounded in the remote Quebrada del Uro. A brief firefight ended with Guevara wounded and captured by Bolivian soldiers. For the first time since the revolution began nearly a decade earlier, he was no longer moving forward. No mountains to retreat into, no reinforcements coming. Only uncertainty inside a small village schoolhouse where the next decision would not be his to make. And within hours, the struggle that defined his life would reach its final moment, one that would echo far beyond Bolivia's borders. On October 9, 1967, the decision was carried out quietly. No battlefield, no final speech to the world. Ernesto Guevara, held in the Bolivian village of La Higuera after his capture the previous day, executed by a Bolivian soldier following orders from the country's military leadership. He was 39 years old. The operation unfolded under intense secrecy, shaped by both domestic authority and the wider tensions of the Cold War. News of his death spread rapidly across continents. But confusion came first. Officials initially claimed he had died from wounds received in combat. Soon, photographs of his body were released to the press intended to prove the revolutionary leader was truly gone. Instead, the images traveled the world and fixed his face permanently in global memory. What was meant to end a story began transforming it. Supporters mourned him as a martyr who had sacrificed everything for political ideals. Critics pointed to the violence of guerrilla warfare and the consequences of revolutionary rule in Cuba. Even in death, agreement proved impossible. His remains were buried in an unmarked grave near Valle Grande, their location unknown to the public for decades. The secrecy suggested fear not of the man himself, but of what his memory might inspire, because something unusual was already happening. A defeated guerrilla in a remote Bolivian village was becoming a worldwide symbol, appearing on posters, banners, and protest movements. His image, captured years earlier by Alberto Corda, began a second life. The man was gone, but the symbol was only beginning, and symbols often travel further than the people who create them. In the years after his death, Ernesto Guevara's presence did not fade. It expanded across borders, languages, and generations that had never seen him alive. Student movements in Europe carried his portrait through crowded streets. Protesters in Latin America invoked his name as a promise that resistance was still possible. For many, he represented defiance against inequality and foreign domination. For others, he symbolized the dangers of armed revolution and one-party rule. The same image inspired hope and warning. Few historical figures divide opinion so completely. Fewer still remain culturally visible decades after their death. In 1997, 30 years after his execution, a team of specialists located remains believed to be Guevara's near Valle Grande, Bolivia. Forensic analysis supported the identification. His remains were returned to Cuba and reburied in the city of Santa Clara. Santa Clara, the site of his most decisive military victory during the revolution. Thousands attended the ceremony, transforming a long-hidden grave into a national monument. Yet the deeper transformation had already occurred. His photograph, head tilted slightly upward, eyes fixed beyond the frame, became one of the most reproduced images in modern history. Printed on posters, clothing, murals, and political banners, it moved far beyond the specific ideas he once argued. In some places, the image stood for revolution. In others, for youth rebellion, or simply style detached from history. A complex life was becoming a simplified symbol, admired, criticized, commercialized, and this raised a difficult question that history still has not settled. The controversial official, the global icon, or the man hidden somewhere beneath all of them? To answer that, we have to return not to how he died, but to what he believed. At the center of Ernesto Guevara's life was not power, but belief. He argued that revolutions were not only political events, they were moral transformations. A new society, in his view, required a new kind of human being, one motivated less by personal reward and more by collective responsibility. He called this idea the creation of the new man, shaped through shared struggle, education, and sacrifice. To supporters, this vision offered dignity in a world marked by inequality. To critics, it sounded like an attempt to reshape individuals through ideology and state control. The same words carried hope and unease. As Minister of Industries in Cuba, Guevara pushed for rapid industrialization and voluntary labor campaigns, encouraging citizens to work beyond material incentives. He believed economic systems driven purely by profit would reproduce injustice, but results were mixed. Production targets were often missed, shortages persisted. The distance between revolutionary ideals and everyday reality became harder to ignore. He accepted austerity personally, living with relative simplicity compared to many officials. Yet the broader experiment faced pressures. No single leader could resolve international isolation, dependence on Soviet trade, and the limits of centralized planning inside a small island economy. What makes Guevara difficult to categorize is this tension between intention and outcome. He pursued equality with uncompromising intensity, but the methods he endorsed, including armed struggle and strict political control, remain deeply contested. History rarely offers clean judgments. Instead, it leaves contradictions that refuse to disappear. And perhaps the most revealing question is not whether he was hero or villain, but why his story still feels urgent long after the Cold War that shaped it has ended. Because the forces he confronted, power, inequality, revolution, sacrifice, have not disappeared. They have only changed form. To understand why Ernesto Guevara still matters, you have to look beyond the legend and into the human cost of the era that shaped him. The mid-20th century was defined by confrontation, empires collapsing, new nations struggling to define themselves, superpowers competing for influence across continents. In that environment, choices felt absolute, neutral ground was rare. Leaders and movements were pulled into alliances that promised survival but demanded loyalty. Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union placed the island at the center of global tension, most dramatically during the 1962 missile crisis, when the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. Guevara supported confrontation with the United States more aggressively than some of his allies. Documents and testimonies from the period show he believed the global balance of power required bold resistance, even under extreme risk. Others inside the Cuban leadership favored caution, aware that survival of the revolution depended on avoiding total destruction. These disagreements revealed a deeper divide about strategy and about how far conviction should go. Yet beyond geopolitics, ordinary lives were unfolding. Families adapting to shortages, young people mobilized by ideology, exiles leaving the country with uncertain futures. By the time his life ended in a small Bolivian village, Ernesto Guevara had already become more than a man. To some, he was a symbol of resistance against injustice. To others, a warning about the dangers of revolutionary power. The truth lies somewhere in the tension between those views. Guevara's story does not end with his death. It turns a defeated revolutionary into an immortal symbol,